Good morning, everybody. Thank you all so much for being here. I think it's important just to to give some space to the fact that we're all kind of living in a weird, challenging new funding environment. So it means a lot to all of us who are on the board at Augo and the staff that all of you show up every year anyway. But this year, it is particularly fun to see all of you. And thank you for showing up. Even though it may not have been the easiest thing for you to do. But yeah, with that, welcome to the symposium. Last night we kind of determined, or well, Sean and Kathy probably knew this beforehand, but we have more first-time attendees at the symposium this year than ever before, which is fantastic. So especially welcome to you all if it's your first time here. Yeah, Sean already thanked Far Fresh Rhode Island, but thank you again, and also to Sarah. I love this event. It's why I'm serving on the board of Augo. It's why I agreed to become the board chair. And it has been for me, and for Glen, Kentucky, just pretty revolutionary every time I come here. I feel like I'm always kind of worn out by the time I get here and by the time I leave. I go back and I feel rejuvenated and kind of ready to go. And I'm always full of fresh ideas about just about everything that we do as organizations, from different ways to approach programming to different funding strategies and every other facet of our organization. And that is all fantastic, but as Sean spoke about this last night, when we were gathered outside before the Freaky Fruit Fall, or maybe after, but the most important, sort of the core part of this event, I think, they spoke about it before too, but I'm going to harp on it again, is really, what I really come back with is just this: the energy comes from the community that we create here. It's just critical, and I've made friends at the symposium, some of whom aren't even here anymore, that I still talk to frequently, and that I probably will for hopefully the rest of my life. But that's the kind of community that we create here, and that's why I love being here. And I hope that you all get the same thing out of it. We've worked to kind of build in a little bit more time this year for everybody to get to know each other a little better, whether that's through the roundtable sessions, the events, what have you. But please, as Sean said, we implore you to take that time and to really get to know each other and reach out sort of beyond the group that you came with. And yeah, make that community for yourselves. I love what we're doing this year. The slate of speakers and presentations that we have feels a little more focused to me. And the focus really is on narrative and storytelling, probably first and foremost, and sort of getting beyond the raw data and numbers that we all generate as organizations, which probably most of us lean on too heavily in just about every way in terms of telling our story. So I think you're going to come away with a lot of information. And, obviously we can't completely put that down, but how to widen that scope and tell the story of your organization in a way that perhaps hopefully is more engaging. And beyond that, there is also a heavy emphasis on volunteer engagement and funding strategy, which I think we probably all need right now. With that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce you to our keynote speaker for this year's symposium. His name is Jonathan Bloom. He is a journalist and the author of the book American Wasteland: How America Throws Away Half of Its Food and What We Can Do About It. He is, I think, one of our leading thinkers in this space. And his work focuses heavily on exposing the root causes of food waste, but perhaps more importantly, he is shining a light on innovative people and practices that might help us reverse force. So I'd like to introduce you to Jonathan Bloom.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Jimmy, for that kind of introduction, and thank you to Ago, it's however you want to say it. Ego. All right. I have been teaching for the last 3 years, and we usually start every day with a little call and response to make sure everybody is focused and awake. So follow my lead. Wow, that was fabulous. You all are ready for middle school. Congratulations. Awesome. So as I mentioned, I've been teaching writing to 8th graders. A bit of a masochistic exercise, but it keeps me young. All that to say, if none of you are passing notes, or if nobody here calls me bro, then it will be a great day. All right, so Sean and Kathy have been so helpful in putting this together. I'm really excited to be here. Gosh, look around. What a cool group of people. You know this, but a lot of times when I give talks, it's a little stuffier, and it's really nice to just be in this friendly environment. Okay, so I approach this talk with a great deal of humility. I don't have work boots on. I'm not out in the field gleaning fruits and vegetables like most of you all. And I have a great appreciation for the work that you do. So with that, thank you so much. And we'll get into some of the slides. All right, one quick programming note. I will talk for a bit and ramble and hopefully not make too many corny jokes. We'll see. But at the end, we're going to leave plenty of room for questions. So if you have a question, just make sure you write it down. Don't forget. We'll get to a bit of a discussion at the end, and I'm looking forward to that part. So, all right, a bit about me before we move on. Okay. So we're here talking a little bit about the story of gleaning, but I wanted to get into my story. Just a little background for you. So I was just a young journalism student and was brought to a place called DC Central Kitchen. And I won't say what year this was. I don't want to betray too much information, but it was a long time ago. Did not have any gray hair. So I'm looking around at all of this recovered food, all of these beautiful racks of ribs, leg of lamb, seafood, really beautiful stuff. And I'm thinking, how does this make any sense? How was this food that someone had decided they didn't want? It just did not compute. I started asking a bunch of questions about where this food came from, why it was deemed excess, and the answers really didn't make sense. And all that to say, I've really just been asking questions from that day forward, and I haven't stopped asking why we waste so much food, how it is possible, and trying to find solutions. So that day was really eye-opening. I'm sure a bunch of you have similar stories of coming to see how much food is wasted in this country, or maybe just seeing the solution through gleaning. But that day was really consequential for me because it led me down this path. So after that, I started the blog Wasted Food, just to kind of get some of my musings out there, a bit of the research and discoveries on where food was being wasted, why it was happening, and what some of the fabulous solutions were, where there was opportunity for more solutions. That led me to writing the book American Wasteland. And since that was published, I've had the opportunity to travel around and give lots of talks like this. But everywhere I go, whenever I arrive, I always ask, what's the gleaning situation? What's happening locally with the fruit trees? Who's going out into the fields and recovering the farm produce that is oh so fresh and healthy? And sometimes there are good answers. There seem to be more and more answers to this problem as gleaning has spread. But by and large, I do see it as still just this massive opportunity. And it's an opportunity that you all are making good on. Okay, so when I have been doing the research, the one other thing I'll say is most of my hands-on experience is with sweet potato gleaning or working with the Society of St. Andrew in some capacity. And we usually have this annual event called the Yam Jam. It's pretty fun. It's we'll see a picture of it a little bit later. But I will say that most of my humor is a bit corny and a bit yam-fisted. So, like I said, I apologize in advance, but gotta have a little bit of fun, right? Okay, so the story with wasted food. Let's move on to that. All right.
Yeah, I got you.
Perfect. Okay, we'll do it that way. So I don't wanna bore you with the basics. I'm sure most of you are pretty familiar with the overall picture, but it's helpful to get a grounding in the scope. So about 30 to 40% of all the food produced in this country is not, in fact, used. It adds up to a pretty massive amount, and roughly under 48 billion pounds, as you see there, comes at a pretty significant cost. It's a good deal of money that we've invested in food that is not being used. And then more germane to our world, about a quarter of the wasted food is coming at the farm level. So it's a huge target. It's a ripe target for action, and that's where a lot of the gleaning will come in. Households and farms, those seem to be the two main opportunities. I'm partial to the farm level, as I'm sure a lot of you are, because as I mentioned, it's untouched, unprocessed, the healthiest possible food out there. And if we're going to try and serve people in need, let's get them the healthiest food possible. Let's not redistribute cupcakes and cakes the supermarket wants to toss out because they're closer to trash than food. They're not all that nutritious. Okay, so all that to say, gleaning and farm level recovery is really where it's at. Okay, so those are a bunch of numbers I just threw at you, but what does that actually look like? Well, I have an image for you. Okay, so this is the Rose Bowl. It's a 90,000 seat stadium. I heard a woo. Wisconsin or TCU, maybe? Okay, just Rose Bowl, Pasadena, California, 90,000 seat stadium. Well, every day, America is wasting enough food to fill that stadium with food. Every day. And in fact, since I started my research, we can say that we are wasting enough food to fill it 2 times. So it's pretty impressive and disgusting and overpowering. That image is something that stays with me. Just the thought of all that food being wasted across the country. So hopefully by the end of this decade, we'll have taken a bite out of that problem. There's a goal to reduce food waste nationally. We're making a little bit of progress. We need to make a lot more progress, but hopefully we'll get that image down to at least closer to 1 Rose Bowl a day, as we're trying to cut our food waste down. Okay, so moving on. It's important to think about why the story of food waste matters. And pretty soon I will get into why the story of gleaning it matters. But sticking with the broader topic of food waste, there aren't too many times in life where things are completely black and white. And there is no middle road. There's no it depends. If there's excess food out there and we can recover it and redistribute it, we need to do that. And that's what we're doing. And so it's important to think about how we are providing that solution. And when we fight food waste, we're not only doing the right thing ethically, but we're on the right side of history, nutrition, climate change, and even economics. So I think a lot of us have this inside us, have this notion that when there's food that is being wasted, that is wrong, and it's something that we gotta undo and we need to address. But hopefully that's something that empowers you and gets you out of bed every day. Because for me, it's the real driver on why we need to focus on this issue and even make it more efficient and effective. Okay, so just to drill down on that a tiny bit, the reason a lot of us have this visceral reaction to seeing food being wasted is because to have hungry people in this world, on the one hand, and have excess food being wasted, that juxtaposition, hungry people, wasted food, that is morally callous. That is unconscionable. So to have that coexistence of hunger and waste hopefully drives us to action and to remedy that problem. And I know I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, but I think it's important to really have that as our grounding purpose and to acknowledge that, to state it, so that we are all feeling really good about the work that we do. Okay, so thank you for being part of that solution. All right, and then to put it into another person's words, that's a really faint picture of the recently passed Pope Francis. Rest in peace. But I really appreciate his wisdom. Throwing away food is like stealing from the table of the poor and the hungry. I really like how he put that. All right, so amen to that. All right, moving on. So let's shift to the environmental question. Why does the story of food waste matter? Well, the simple answer is wasting food has tremendously harmful environmental consequences. You can look at the greenhouse gases that we are emitting through the wasted energy use, and then also the methane emissions that come when food waste ends up in a landfill. You add all that up, and it's about 4% of United States greenhouse gas emissions. 4% doesn't really sound like much, but when we're talking about curbing climate change, that's a huge target, especially given how avoidable food waste is. Okay, so there's that impact of greenhouse gases. There's also a tremendous amount of cropland that's being given over to growing food that is not then used. We're cutting down forests left and right around the planet to grow more food, to have too much food. Doesn't really make tons of sense. So we need to remedy that situation. We're also making it so biodiversity is decreasing every year by cutting down all that land. We're also reducing soil fertility by not allowing land to lay fallow. So all of that to say, it's not a great idea to the system that we have created. No one really set out to create this system, but if we were going to start from scratch, we would not do it this way. We'd be a lot more efficient. All right, and then also on the environmental front, we should talk about water. Raise your hands if you've heard about the planet getting a little warmer. Okay, so that's gonna make it so there is less fresh water. Saw some hands. I think we're all there. All right, the planet is warming. We could argue about that later. I really don't want to argue about it. It seems like a pretty acknowledged and established scientific fact. Anyway, the planet is getting warmer. Fresh water is going to be harder to come by. So having this massive amount of fresh water go toward growing food that we don't use is a poor use of those freshwater resources. And it's going to become more and more scarce. And it's going to become something that's fought over, as folks in the western part of the US can tell you about. All right, so a good estimate is that about a Great Salt Lake's worth of fresh water is wasted every year growing food that is not used. It's a little bit of a confusing metaphor because the Great Salt Lake is salty, but anyway, it's fresh water, the same volume as the Great Salt Lake. All right, with me on that, thumbs up. Okay, all right, next please. So when Project Drawdown looked at solutions to combat climate change, they found that food waste or reducing food waste was the #3 most effective solution out there. They ran the scenario 2 times. The second time they found that it was the #1 solution. So all that to say, pat on the back to us, to everyone in this room, we're actually having a major impact by reducing food waste. So I take great spirit and heart from that data points. It shows me that we're on the right track. So not only does it make sense what we're doing ethically, it's kind of like the obvious answer in my mind, but it's also the most, or one of the top 3 most environmentally friendly and intelligent solutions. So good on us. Okay. Moving on to the next topic. So what is our story with gleaning? So honing in on gleaning. As I'm sure a lot of you know, there's a great and rich history of gleaning. It dates back to at least the Old Testament, and Deuteronomy talks about leaving the edges of the fields for those in need. There's a tale obviously about Ruth, as you see pictured. Ruth gleaning from the fields of Boaz. I'm not up here to preach, but I think this kind of history definitely gives us a grounding and a firm ground when we're going out and talking to people. It also gives us a bit of a leg up when we are talking to faith groups in the Judeo-Christian tradition, helps with funding, helps with finding volunteers. I think it's important to appreciate and acknowledge that history. I think it's also possible to wonder about Ruth's budget for her wardrobe. It's like Old Testament Vogue over there. Maybe if she didn't spend as much on her robes, she wouldn't have to glean. But just a question I'll throw out there. Who am I to judge? Okay. All right, moving on. The word gleaning in the English language dates back to the 14th century, and there is a rich history of gleaning throughout the Middle Ages as times were difficult. And then it became this really cool topic for artists, a subject for a lot of 18th and 19th century painters. This is Jean-Francois Millet, the Gleaners, and it's in the school of thought of 19th century realism, which I appreciate because gleaning is nothing if not real. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to point out is that I think of gleaning as a real beautiful activity. It's wonderful to look at, but it's also beautiful in terms of the activity and the roots of that activity, the outcome of a gleaning day. So if we go to the next slide, I think of this as a beautiful scene. It's beautiful not only visually, but spiritually. It's bucolic, vigorous, vital, and as we talked about, ethical. So I think that's part of our story, is celebrating the beauty of a day out in community, working, sweating next to your brothers and sisters, your new friends, your community. This is actually a picture of the Yam Jam, one of the Yam Jams from days back. And even more beautiful than this picture, if we go to the next one, is the output. I mean, you've all seen this picture in real life. You probably lived this picture, but these are all sweet potatoes that would have just been plowed under. And instead, they're going to help feed people. So that is beautiful. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that. If I did this every day, I might get a little jaded. I might not appreciate the beauty of both the activity and the output. But I think it's important to recognize that and really celebrate it. And maybe you can do that in some of your messaging. Okay, gleaning takes many forms, as you know. Here's another more recent form of gleaning from yesterday. I really appreciated that at the end of the Freaky Fruit call. Some people, I think Jimmy was even involved, some people actually ate the fruit vessels that went down that slide. So that's really cool. So gleaning today takes many forms. Sometimes you're out in the field, sometimes you're harvesting from trees. You know the deal. But wherever you're doing it, I think it's important to recognize the beauty. Okay, so now's the time where we need to think about what our story is. What is your story in this world of gleaning? Okay, so it's an important question for us to consider. And in many ways, figuring out your story and being able to tell it will make the difference between being seen and not being seen. Being a niche group that plugs away and works super hard, but doesn't quite get the exposure that you deserve. So I think it's definitely worth taking the time to think about. I know today there will be several chances to visualize and actually detail your story. And I hope that you do take advantage of that. In school, we talk about going slow to go fast. So really working on something to then be able to go super quickly. In school, it's a little different. Maybe it's working on our clapping to get in rhythm, so that then the next time we do it, we're just lights out. But I would encourage you to take advantage of the storytelling sessions and really take a moment to think about your organization and how it's different, how it distinguishes itself. Okay, so establishing your story, as I mentioned, it does help distinguish you from others. I mean, even within this room, there are a lot of different types of gleaning organizations, a lot of food recovery orgs out there. There are a lot of nonprofits, there's a lot of charities, 501c3s. So where do you fit into that whole world? How do you stand out? Those are some questions that hopefully you'll be able to answer if you take the time to really think about it. Okay, so as I mentioned before, it's gonna help you stand out, but also just taking a step back and thinking about what you do, it might help you see your organization with fresh eyes. If you do something every day, it's kind of hard to do that. So taking a step back, maybe being at this conference, being away from your work will be a good opportunity for you to really see your work afresh. And if that doesn't work, one trick in writing, we always want to have someone else look at our work, get a fresh set of eyes. So maybe ask someone who's not in your organization to maybe try and sum up your work. Have them look at your website and give you a fresh perspective on what you do. That is a neat opportunity to try and help each other out. Okay, so maybe find a friend, find a partner here, and get a fresh set of eyes. Okay, moving on. So how do we tell this story? There are a number of ways. It'd be kind of weird if I had no ideas on how we tell the story. I do have a couple of answers for this question, but I don't have all the answers. So I do recommend really dialing in on those sessions later, where I'm sure we're gonna really get into the nitty gritty on your story. But I have some thoughts. So first off, I would encourage you to think like a journalist. I'm a little biased here. I did go to journalism school. Worst money I ever spent. Not exactly a booming industry, but it's important in some ways useful, because it teaches you how to think, teaches you to ask questions, and to really get into the roots of a cause. So I would encourage you to think like a journalist. You don't necessarily have to wear one of those old-timey hats. You don't even have to smoke a pipe, but feel free. But you should think about the 5 W's: who, what, when, where, why, and how. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. Really wish the how started with a W. It doesn't. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of your story. You want to get those out there. Make sure that when you're telling your story, or when you're setting up your website or revamping your website, it has the basic skeleton facts there of the 5 W's. And then you want to really think about objectivity. Now, we could nerd out and talk about whether anyone or anything is really objective. It's kind of a philosophical debate people get into in journalism school. We don't have time for that. I think there is some objectivity to be had. I think there is a root cause of objectivity, of trying to be honest. Just be truthful. That's all I'm saying. Don't exaggerate. Just say things how they are. And then the other thing that I would really push you to think about is why now? So if you wanted to write an article about your organization, you would pitch an editor at a newspaper still exists, at a website or news organization, and the editor would say, why now? Why are we writing about this at this point in time? So you have to have an answer for that. You've been at this gleaning thing for a while. Why now should there be an article? And so the answers to that will vary. Maybe it's we've recovered our 1,000th ton. Maybe we've just fed our 1,000,000th customer. Whatever it may be. Or we're expanding. We just broke ground on this new facility that's going to do X, Y, and Z. Have an answer for why now. That's important. And the other thing with journalism is, despite what you might hear from Washington, it is nonfiction. True journalism is nonfiction. So we're truthful. Okay, but there is such a thing as creative nonfiction. So you get to choose how you tell your story. You get to choose how you frame your organization's story. You get to decide where it starts and what is included and what's excluded. So that's where there's some creativity, there's some room. Maybe you want to focus on the tree gleaning that you do. Maybe you want to focus on recovering food from schools. Maybe you want to focus on how you are having internships and getting college students involved. Whatever story you want to tell, it's important that we tell it well, but also you get to choose where the story begins and what's included. We don't always get to decide how the story ends. That's sort of another philosophical question for another time. But we get to certainly dictate where it starts and where it goes. So that's a lot of power. It's a lot of room for creativity. I hope you use it well. Okay, moving on. So we're going to talk a little bit about narrative today. In some of the other sessions, people throw that word around a lot, narrative. There's a few different ways of thinking about it, but in my mind, a good narrative is something that really grabs your attention. And when I'm talking to my students about writing, I teach 8th grade writing. I always say, you want your opening, you want your words or your pictures to reach out and really grab the reader or viewer. I sometimes say you wanted to grab them by the lapels, but then I realized they don't know what lapels are. I don't think there are too many lapels in this room. That's a good thing. Okay, but anyways, you want to have your words really grab people's attention and reel them in and make it so they can't help but pay attention and want to see what happens next. And you do that with a great narrative. You tell a story. And every story has two things. It has a protagonist and it has a problem. So there has to be some tension. There has to be a problem to overcome. Now, if I were to go back a few slides, I have a pretty good idea of what the problem is in most of your stories, but maybe not. So maybe it's this giant food waste problem. Maybe it's hunger, but maybe it's something else. Maybe you are having to overcome funding challenges or labor issues, legal issues, whatever it may be. You get to tell your story, but it has to have some sort of problem or conundrum that gets solved. And so you can follow this story arc if you want. It sort of depends how much time you have in your storytelling. But whatever you do, make sure that it's gripping and that we have a problem that's being solved. Okay, cool. So moving on from that. What I would also advise is that you do a bit of bragging. Now, hopefully you're doing more than just getting out of bed. We don't want to brag about that, but what we are all doing is brag worthy. Now, I've gotten to know a few people in this room and y'all are great folks. I get the feeling you're pretty modest, pretty humble, pretty down to earth. So this might not be easy for you to do. You look like a pretty modest group, but in this world, we need to sing our own praises. We need to tell the world how great we are. So whether or not that comes naturally to you, you need to get used to that. Do a little bit of bragging. Tell everyone how many pounds of fruit and vegetables you've recovered, how many meals you've created. Tell the world how awesome you are. If you don't do that, nobody will. So I think we can get there. Yes? Great. All right. So we're going to do a little bit of bragging, not too much, but just a little. That's part of telling a good story. That's part of our story and your story. Okay. And then we're going to keep it positive. It's really important to be inclusive in our storytelling and to frame it positively. We don't want to alienate people that we don't have to. We want to keep it inclusive. And that's a great way to make sure that we're not having our funding cut or we're getting more funding because we're positive. People don't want to hear you complain. They want to hear you overcoming problems and finding solutions. So it's important to do that, to keep positive. I think a lot of you already are doing that. Seems like a pretty can-do group. But I would just remind you, in these difficult times, as there are so many cuts to funding and organizations and everything else, we have to try to look at it as something that is a challenge to be overcome. And how do we keep doing the excellent work we're doing despite the difficulties? Okay, moving on. Okay, so a quick question here. Raise your hand if you like seeing food being wasted. Okay, good. That was a test. You all passed. I did not see any hands raised. Yeah, you would really have to be reprehensible, evil to enjoy that. No one likes seeing food being wasted. I actually asked ChatGPT to make a picture of an evil man raising his hand. And that's what it came up with. Anyway, all that to say, just in any room in the world, you could ask that question and you would not see any hands. There are very few questions you could ask and get universal approval. So I say that to encourage you to think about how popular and universal preventing wasted food is. And hopefully we take a lot of courage and spirit from that. We are empowered by the universality of our work. And we can play to that. It's a super popular idea. Whenever you tell anyone what you're doing, I'm guessing they kind of start nodding along and they're like, oh yeah, I did see my mother-in-law throw away a whole plate of food and it did kind of irk me. Or yeah, I was at school volunteering and I saw all the students throwing away trays of food and it got kind of oh, it's really annoying. Or, oh, I was wondering what happened behind supermarkets in the dumpsters. So I'm sure you've had this experience where you tell people about preventing food waste and there's a visceral response. People start nodding along. So I would encourage you to build on that and to take confidence from it, because the work we're doing is not only powerful and not only important, but it is popular. It's incredibly popular. And if we move on to the next one, it's a message that can help us reach just about anyone in this country or in the world, regardless of political persuasion, religious beliefs, race, age, TV preferences, you name it. Whatever people are into, they are going to be into not wasting food. And so I would encourage us to really think about that as this grounding reason why our work should be something that politicians and people on both sides of that political persuasion focus on and fund and volunteer for. It's not easy to find an issue or a topic that is bipartisan, but I think preventing wasted food is one of them. And it's one of the few things that has received support on both sides of the aisle in terms of recent bills in Congress. So as you're thinking about the popularity of this issue and how universal it is, I think it's important in your messaging to not turn anyone off, to make sure that if you're sending this website out to someone you know voted Republican, or you know voted Democrat, there's no red flags. There's no issues that will make it so they can see this topic as a niche thing that's only on one side of the aisle. Now, a quick little example of that, because that sounds great, but what does that look like in detail? I think about the word hunger and hunger relief. So thinking as a journalist and trying to be universal, I have seen some hunger relief programs be red flags for people currently in power in Washington. So I have a lot of hats I can wear. I'll just wear my journalist hat right now. If I were trying to play the middle and avoid pissing anyone off, I might stray from using the hunger word. I might focus on reducing food waste or gleaning, food recovery. Those seem like pretty bulletproof terms, whereas hunger relief might be seen as something that we want to cut funding from. Now, I don't necessarily agree with it. I don't agree with that. Let me just be clear. I don't agree with that thinking. But I also, if I'm running an organization, I want to make sure that we don't have our funding cut or that we don't have a drop off in volunteers. We don't want to get canceled if we don't have to. So I'm not asking you to change anything you do. This is just a decision that you might want to make. I'm just giving a little bit of advice and thinking about how we navigate through the next 4 years. So thinking about the terminology we use, thinking about words, because I do think words are powerful. And so picking our words carefully is important. Okay, so we can delve into that a little later. It's kind of a strange topic. I'm sad that we actually have to talk about that stuff, but that is reality. Okay, so those are some tactics for telling your story. And let's move on and think about 3 key areas as we look ahead. All right, next, thanks. Okay, so 3 keys. All right, so the first one there, we've kind of talked about that a bit, but trying to keep a broad appeal. What that means is, yeah, just reaching as many people as possible, trying to have a big tent approach. Big tent approach. Oh, not that kind of tent. No, different kind of tent. Not that kind of tent. No, it's not a circus. It's an organization. All right, next one. Okay, a big tent approach. That old-timey term for trying to reach as many people as possible, trying to have a broad coalition of people involved, volunteers and funders and partners. So we need to reach out far and wide. We need to make new connections, introduce yourself around, get introduced to as many people as possible. If we are having a hard time finding funders or volunteers, we need to work a little harder and tell a great story so that everyone wants to be part of your organization. I'm sure you're gonna revamp your story so that it really grabs people's attention and pulls them in and they want desperately to be part of your group. We also want to make sure that we're bipartisan. And so we're gonna look through our materials and make sure there are no red flags. Okay, those are some quick thoughts on how we do that, have that big tent approach. All right, the next topic, and it's something that I'm passionate about. We need to reach young people. So the kids in America especially are receiving a food waste education today. When you get a school lunch, you don't get to decide what you want. You don't get to decide how much you want. You're given a tray. And if you don't want that food, you just throw it out. A lot of times they are taking a tray because the school makes them, and then they're just putting it right in the trash. Now, I will say the food quality isn't the best. I kind of understand the rationale behind so much of that food being thrown out. We don't fund school lunch very well. We don't put much money into making sure what ends up on that tray is nutritious, well, palatable or appealing. We focus a lot on the nutrition, but not as much on the quality of the food, making it appealing and something kids want to eat. So anyway, every day we're teaching kids that food is trash. Okay, so instead, what we need to do is give our young people a food education, not a food waste education. We need to flip that around. So how we do that is we involve students and young people in every facet of the food system. So teach students how to grow food, teach them how to cook, teach them to recover or redistribute that food in the lunchroom. Having a share table prevents a lot of food waste. So all those packaged foods and whole fruits can be put aside and redistributed. Getting kids to be part of that solution is incredibly important, not only in terms of the poundage that's recovered, but in terms of winning hearts and minds and teaching kids that food is not trash. Okay, so hopefully we will be doing that and teaching kids that food is something to be treasured. So love food and hate waste. So winning hearts and minds is really important because students are excellent ambassadors for this issue. Once they get latched onto a topic, they're really good at convincing others that we should focus on it. And also, it kind of goes without saying, but students, young people are the future. So if they grow up thinking that food is trash, that's going to be the mainstream attitude on food. But if we teach them that food is precious, that food is life, then the opposite will happen, and we'll have a much more virtuous society, at least in terms of food. Okay, so what I would encourage you to do as people who lead organizations is to harness youth energy, much like we would renewable energy like wind and solar. So kids have a tremendous amount of actual energy to get out there and, oh, I don't know, recover fruits and vegetables. But so we need to get them out there. We need to find those youth groups wherever we can, whether it's school groups, faith groups, 4-H, and Future Farmers of America. Pull them in, get them out there in the fields, up on the ladders, doing the hard work, harness the energy that way. But we also need to bring them into this movement and get them on board as messengers. So harnessing young people is going to be incredibly important, and it will be rewarding. It won't be easy work, but once you get it set up, it will be rewarding because they're going to start talking. They're going to start texting and posting, and word spreads so quickly. Now that leads me to another idea. Kids are incredibly smart, and we need to harness that as well. So I talked about texting and posting and all that jazz. Put a teenager in charge of your social media. That is probably the most important message of the day. I think most of us who are over the age of 30 are like past our prime in terms of digital capabilities, okay? Put a teenager in charge of your social media account and it will blossom. And it will be like wildfire. Harnessing kids' native digital intelligence. That's a great use for young people's know-how. Kids are incredibly smart though in general, and they're gonna suggest solutions. They're gonna come up with other suggestions for how you do what you do. They're gonna blow your mind with all of their ideas and intelligence. And a lot of times we take that for granted, or we don't really give young people much credit. They can be a little frustrating to deal with. I have firsthand experience of that with teenagers at home and at school, but they're awesome. They are so full of ideas and energy and aren't afraid to ask the difficult questions. They aren't afraid to think differently. They aren't afraid to ask, why are we doing this way? This is dumb. Let's do it a different way. And, you know, sometimes they're right. Sometimes they're not. But it's important to give them the opportunity. Now, the other thing I should say about young people is that they're really stubborn. And this cuts both ways. It can be negative, it can be positive. When you're in the supermarket and they want a certain kind of cereal and they're super stubborn about it, that's pretty annoying because they're not going to give up until they get it. But we need to harness that where if they're latched onto an issue, if they become messengers and ambassadors for a topic, they're not going to stop talking about it. And they're going to help us spread the cause of preventing wasted food and gleaning as much as we can. And we've seen this happen with recycling, where students learned about recycling in school and they brought it home And they started nagging their parents, why don't we have a recycling bin? Why aren't we recycling? Why are you throwing this bottle into the trash? Why is this newspaper in the trash? It could be recycled. I'm just kidding, no one has newspapers anymore. But the point is, kids are really good at latching onto a topic and making it happen. So let's empower them with our own issues of wasted food and gleaning. And let's make them nag other people on our behalf. Okay, so look to the kids. They will help further our issue. They might actually save us. All right, next topic. Don't forget to have some fun. All right, I couldn't resist putting Homer in there. He's gonna pull that lever for the super fun, happy slide. And we're gonna think about how we approach our work and having a little levity. Not being afraid to smile or even crack a joke or laugh. I think that's really important. Hunger and recovering food is serious stuff. We all know that. We talked about the ethics that ground our work. And it's important to hold that in one hand of how serious our topic is, but then also not take ourselves too seriously, where we can't have some fun and smile. And so I really appreciate the Freaky Fruit vehicles last night because it's kind of doing both. We're all here to talk about an important thing, but we can also have a good time. And I really do believe that if you're running an organization, or if you're controlling their messaging or on social media, it's okay to have a little levity. And in fact, it's beneficial. There's enough seriousness and dourness and frustration in the world. So we need to think about the joy factor. And joy, I saw, will be discussed later with Food Solutions New England. And I'm really excited to see that topic on the agenda. So we need to put some joy into this work. As a specific example, I was just taken aback by Portland Fruit Tree Project, how they are putting this into action. Now, when you go to their website, it looks like a fun time. I want to hang out with these guys. They're making jam. They're having these sessions on pruning trees. They're making pie crust. They're having these community events with the charcuterie board. Oh, is it the charcuterie board? Like that play on words goes a long way. Their email list, you can join their email list to stay in the Fruit Loop. Like that's a small thing, but it goes a long way. And it makes me want to put my email address in there and I want to stay in the Fruit Loop. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind as you're working on your stories. As you get back to work, when you get home, think about having a little bit of fun and living a little. You know, as far as I know, you only live once. I hope I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's what's happening. So you may as well enjoy it. All right. Okay, so smile, have some fun. All right, moving along. Just a little fuel for your fire to keep you motivated. There's that data point we talked about where doing what we do, preventing wasted food, is the number 3 or number 1 most productive way to combat climate change. So let's keep that in mind as we get to work. And also the EPA, if that still exists, wants us to think about where we prioritize our actions, and reducing the amount of excess food is the most preferable solution. The EPA used to have those pyramids of hierarchies. Now they've got this thing, I don't really even know what to call it. It's a scale. Anyway, the important thing is that preventing food waste from happening, as you are all doing, is the #1 most impactful solution. So kudos to you, keep doing what you're doing. And moving on, thinking about the stakes of our work. When we think about the estimates for global population change, in 2050, there's supposed to be 9.8 billion people on this planet. It's a lot of zeros. It's a lot of zeros up there, and it's a lot of mouths to feed. So people hear those estimates and a lot of people will say, let's cut down more rainforests to create more farmland. Let's turn to GMO crops to create more food for all those people. Those are different topics for a different day. But my point is that before we turn to those solutions, let's try to be as efficient as we can with our food. We have a lot of food. We have too much food, but we have plenty. So let's try to keep doing what we're doing, redistribute that excess to those in need, and make the planet a better place. So thank you so much for your time. With that, I am happy to take questions and have a little bit of a dialogue. And I'm also going to stick around. So if you have a question you want to ask that's more about your organization, we can chat about that offline. All right, here's my info. Here's my younger child with a radish. That would be a big radish. That's my old truck back to Yam Jam days. All right. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'd love to hear your thoughts or questions. All right, question in the middle. Yes, ma'am.
I actually started my cleaning 10, 12 years ago with DC Central Kitchen. So that's how I got started. And so is this on?
Right.
Okay.
Otherwise, just talk about, we'll figure it out.
So I started about 10, 12 years ago with DC Central Kitchen, and then I kind of spread out from there, and now I'm with Arlington Friends of Urban Agriculture. And one thing that I'm kind of proud of Arlington for starting a composting program. That was home compost as part of the regular trash pickup. But we have lots and lots of multi-family dwellings, apartment buildings, condos, and we started on street compost a year ago now, and it's been hugely successful. They're getting more bids through the Big Belly program that's also in New York City. But just in listening to you and thinking about, and as involved as I am with cleaning and with food recovery and with Arlington County, we're missing the in-between. Don't waste it before it gets to the compost bin. And it just kind of got me thinking that that's the little connection piece that we can really work on a lot more. It's great that we have this program. We're getting a lot of the compost to our gardens, or I guess under gardens, but that in between part that we're actually missing. Don't waste it in the first place. So this got me thinking.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for sharing that. I totally agree. Whenever I talk to people, say whatever I do, I fight food waste, blah, blah. They say, oh, cool, yeah, I compost. And I'm like, okay. Like, I don't know. It sort of seems like that's the least you could do. Like, composting is great, but it's also not that great. Like, it's not asking people to change their behavior, just to redistribute their trash in different ways. So it's important, but it's not that important. And I think like focusing on the reductions is where the work is. That's where the real work happens. And getting that behavior change, that's where we need to put our efforts. Thanks.
One more question.
One more question, and then we gotta stay on schedule.
I really appreciate this. I think, I speak for myself, and I'm sure many of us find this to be true, that we don't spend enough time telling our story, and often we take for granted how obvious this is to people, like, of course we shouldn't waste food. And I think in that moment, I kind of just like think, oh yeah, everybody knows this stuff. I can kind of glaze over the heart of like, you know, what is food waste, and also like the beauty of cleaning. I really appreciate you took some time to describe like, you know, how poetic and sweet and whatever it is. I'm curious from your perspective, since you're telling the story all the time, when you are starting to talk to people who are like brand new, maybe you've not really considered this concept before, what are the anecdotes or things that you start with to really grab people's attention?
Ooh, good question. I tend to go with the like, clean your plate because there are children starving somewhere. And I love that topic because it's kind of like, it's pretty universal. Like a lot of people grew up hearing that. And the place where people are starving changes depending on what generation you're from. And like, that saying is a little problematic because it like gets into overeating or like guilt. It invites guilt into the conversation, but I like it because it's pretty universal. Oh, your parents probably told you not to waste food. Do you know why they told you not to waste food, or why does it matter? And I find it's like a nice entry point. If that doesn't work, I always go back to grandmas. I love grandmas, I love grandmothers. So thinking back to your grandmas or grandma, what did they say? What did they do? How did they use their leftovers? You know, what did they cook? And like, you would never waste any of grandma's blueberry pie, right? I think it's grandma's blueberry pie. So I think like hearkening back to food memories of what you heard at the dinner table, and then also what your wise elders said. Those are two recommendations for how to really reach people on a universal level. All right, well, thank you so much. I'm gonna stick around and I'm happy to chat with y'all later.